Hi, and welcome back. It's been a little bit. It's been like a month. Well, I'm hoping that I can finish this series today, the Finding Myself Again series, and then I'd like to move on and do some videos on some other topics. But it did seem fitting to record this on New Year's Eve, trying to sort of, my cats are playing in the background, trying to start the new year off sort of not saying goodbye to this chapter of my life, but finishing, I guess, this part of my healing journey. And who knows, maybe we'll revisit it again in another 3 years and see where we're at then. Spoiler alert, I just got done finishing recording what I thought I was recording, and none of it recorded. So that's cool. Don't know when we're going to revisit that again, because honestly, I don't know how I feel about it. It's because I was a lot more activated and angry and a little bit more triggered today than I would have liked. So I don't know when or if you will be watching this. So just, a heads up that things did not go as planned. And also, this video is kind of a mess. I feel like there's a lot of probably rambling in it. I'm recording this after I've now recorded the next section today. So I just know that the vibe for me is a little off. I think just because I feel maybe dissociated a little bit, like I'm not really connected fully to my emotions. So I might seem a little off in my discussion, and it's not exactly where I wanted to end the series, but I think it also shows that trauma impacts and affects you differently sometimes, and I would rather you see me a little bit dissociated than what previously happened a couple weeks ago, and I was just really angry. Also, video is very triggering. I'm talking about instances of extreme physical violence and sexual abuse done to a child, that child being me. So watch with caution. And if you can't or don't want to watch, that's okay too. I understand not wanting to watch. I don't really want to record. So yeah, enjoy the video. That's not, take something away from the video that is positive, I hope. Hi. Uh, so that first attempt at recording didn't work out. It stopped recording at some point, but I'm kind of grateful that it did. The first part of that introduction was recorded, I think, a couple weeks ago now. It's kind of a blur. But I got pretty triggered, and I didn't necessarily feel completely like myself or how I wanted to feel. I've been reprocessing some stuff. Healing isn't linear. I think what was really just triggering for me is rewatching that video that I've been reacting to from the 6-year-old video with the 3-year-old video within a 6-year-old video. Why do I have trouble saying that every fucking time? It was just hearing the way I was talking about the last sort of, I guess, part of that story in my childhood, because I've been putting pieces together. Certain things have been less foggy, and yeah, scratching on my door. Hi. I'm recognizing how sexual a lot of the abuse that I experienced was in nature. Like as a whole, not just the part where I was physically molested, but just everything surrounding it. It was very sadistic, and I can look at it now and I see it as like a whole picture of things that were being done to me in such a way that was a very much a power dynamic play, that the people that were supposed to be taking care of me were obviously getting off on. And it seems obvious. It seems now that that should have been obvious, but trauma does weird things to your brain, and it makes it really hard to see things for what they are at the time, especially when someone you love and care about is involved in it. That being my parent. And it's also made me question. I know at the beginning of this series, I had read this letter that I wrote my familial abuser, where I chose to forgive them. And although I don't think that that's changed, I've realized that I'm not ready to send this, if I ever will be, honestly. Because I don't have to let them know. It's not up to me to give them closure for the guilt that they feel for what happened. Even as I enter this new part of my healing journey where I feel as though I've forgiven them. Because I'm at a point right now where I don't know if I honestly want to have any more contact with them at all. It's already been very limited. Not like really, I mean, like I mentioned in my other videos, I didn't have to do much to limit the interactions that we had. But I still would, interact, like, say, happy holidays or whatever, or call like maybe once every 6 months or something. And now I'm kind of questioning if I even am able to do that or if I will want to. Because for so long, I wasn't allowing myself to really grasp the nature of how sadistic it was and how much my parent played a part. Because it was easy for me to see the person that he was dating at the time as the primary abuser because of how psychopathic she was. And she was the instigator, and I do think she was like an infection when it came to how he changed around her. Especially with, including like the involvement of drugs and everything else. And yeah, that's just been harder for me to process than I thought it would be because I thought I already kind of understood that, but I don't think I understood it on a whole. I had everything sort of separated in my head, and I'm going back through this whole journey, revisiting my trauma. I'm seeing this whole big picture of how everything was very sexual. The fact that I was routinely like stripped naked and whipped with a belt. There were certain things where I would be like on my tiptoes, standing in a corner for hours, like through dinner until I would go to bed. And if I fell off of my tiptoes, I would be whipped. Um, I think it was with the ruler, but I'm sure it was with the belt at times too. Um, Also a lot of times like with no clothes on. Like, and I'm seeing that now and how all of that was just very, how all of it was sexual abuse, even before I was touched. The last part of the video, I don't think I'm going to continue reacting to the video just because I think I will get triggered by it again. It's just, I think it might be easier for me to talk about it without hearing it. I know I was talking about how I had said something to my mom about being thrown down the stairs, and then she had contacted child services and took me to the hospital and had me examined. And then the family that I was in custody of were informed of it, and they were actually really nice to me when I got home, which was extremely suspicious. Well, very shortly after that, like I think only a couple weeks later, my stepmom took me to well, she always took me everywhere. I was like always being very isolated from everyone else. So whenever she went somewhere, I went with her. She was going to get her hair done, and I went with her. And then she went down this, I remember this obscure road, like we were going a different way. And she pulled over and she started asking me strange questions about if somebody was touching me, if I remembered being, She also asked me if I remembered basically being molested when I was an infant, which is the first time I found out that I was molested when I was an infant, when my mom had custody of me, because of who, well, they didn't know for sure, but because of who she had me staying at, everyone kind of understood that that's very likely what had happened. So she was asking me if I remembered any of it. And I don't believe I did at the time. I think I still had those memories pretty far blacked out. I was very confused by her line of questioning. And then she turned it to focusing on my mom's fiance, soon to be husband at the time. And when my answer was no, she started pinching me, as hard as she could on my legs, on my arms. And at some point she smacked me. I remember having my head shoved into the dashboard, until I gave her the answer that she wanted to hear, which was that, yes, I was being inappropriately touched by my mom's fiance. Then she drove me back home and forced me to tell my dad. And this whole time, I have no idea what's going on. I don't understand what's happening at this point. But my dad, I just remember he threw the dinner plate like at the wall and it shattered. Which is just so strange to think back on now, because just the amount of anger to the point where I felt like I was in trouble for something. Had even happened. But just thinking about the stuff that I was experiencing in their house that they were doing to me. And yet there was so much anger at the idea of me being harmed outside of the household. It just, looking back, it just feels like, what was the anger about? What was it really directed at? Is it because somebody else was hurting me and only you were allowed to? Like, was it a property thing? It just seems so hypocritical looking back, considering that was in the middle of just experiencing such horrific physical abuse. So that was reported. There was a whole court case about that. He was found not guilty because nothing happened. There was no evidence of it. And also, when I was basically questioned about it, I didn't know how to answer their questions. And I didn't answer them in the way that my step-parent had wanted me to answer them. She was coaching me in some ways, but I don't think I really followed along with it. I think I froze up when I was actually alone with them, because it was harder. It was just difficult to remember exactly what she wanted me to say, because it's not like she knew what they were going to ask me. She just had created this story for me to just sort of script off. So thankfully, he was found not guilty. And although they did get married and my mom had 2 kids with him, we did eventually get in contact when I was probably about 17 years old, which was like the next time that I saw him after this event happened. I was very panicky. Luckily, it was at a family gathering, so we just kind of avoided each other for a while, but eventually I was able to work my way up to come and talk to him, and I did apologize. And while that apology was accepted, it was sort of acknowledged that it wasn't needed, because it was very apparent to everyone what had happened and what had occurred, and that it wasn't something that I had said or did willingly. I also had tried to tell my family on my dad's side multiple times that this never occurred. And I think the first time I told a cousin when I was visiting my mom's mom, and of course that was shut down. And then I think I also told someone on my dad's side of the family again. And I think with the story that was being spun was that I was just making it up because I missed my mom, because my mom lost visitation rights. This is the point where I no longer had a relationship with her, and I wouldn't have a relationship with her until I was in my teenage years. And I was no longer living with my dad at that point. I would have been living with my grandma. But no matter how many times I told them it didn't happen, just nobody would believe me. And even when it got to a point where I finally, I think at around 16 years old, I felt safe enough to bring up the topic again and explain that this never happened. This man never did that to me. There was still this denial about it, like, oh, well, you just don't remember. And it's like, I'm telling you the same thing that I was trying to tell you back then. I was being coached to tell you these things. Like I don't, and it was at this point where everyone knew that I was being abused in that household. I mean, everyone knew before, but it was more like talked about at this point because was out of that house and I was able to talk about it with my grandma. So I'm like, you know that this person was abusing me. She didn't really know my dad's part in it, but she knew some of the horrific things I was experiencing. It's just this denial, I think, because the narrative that they had, they just couldn't let go of the narrative that they spun in their head about this. And there was, I think, so much of an uproar about protecting me and saving me from this horrific abuse that I was experiencing. I also think it kind of served another purpose for my abusers in in the household. So for my step parent and my dad, because it was like they already were kind of going back to, I was such a misbehaved child because of things that I experienced like in infancy with my mother. And now they had something else to fall back to as to why I was so fucked up, why my behavior wasn't typical, why I was having episodes of dissociation with maladaptive daydreaming. This was like just sort of another caveat to sort of explain away my atypical behavior, the behavior of a child that's being abused. And now this is kind of something to explain it away. And also conveniently, it made my mom lose custody after I had told her that I had been thrown down the stairs. So it was like my step parents' like vengeance against myself and my mother for the fact that I said something. I think it's in our nature to try to understand things, and some acts are just so cruel that they're not understandable. It almost feels vengeful now looking back at that this was at the time that I started being molested by my step parent after all of this had happened. The abuse also had gotten much worse. I got punished one time, well, not one time, multiple times, because I wouldn't say that I hated my mom's boyfriend or fiance at the time and then soon to be husband, which it's like, even if he did actually hurt me, why would you punish a child for not saying that they, like, again, it was just all like this game. Everything, all the abuse I experienced was made out to be a game. If I didn't say or do the right thing, I would be punished. Like, I was constantly being like tested, as just a young child. Like, there was no safety for me. So apparently, according to my therapist, a common way that women who molest children will sort of explain it away in such a way that a man would never get away with is that they are cleaning the child. That's apparently a common excuse when they are molesting children. So, which is what she did with me. I mean, and it definitely brainwashed me to a point where I didn't even understand that this was me being molested until I was like a young adult. Because I just didn't process it that way. I processed it as it was just painful and it was just punishment. But I was being caused pain on my genitals. Like, I was being hurt repeatedly, nightly, routinely in that area, where she would say that she needed to clean me. She'd get a rag and she would just scrub me raw, basically, to the point where I would be bleeding and like literally like pissing blood. I mean, I would be screaming. I think this is the part where I understand why I was like left with certain memories of the abuse, but others were sort of taken away or just kind of made really foggy for me. It was just hard for me to accept. It was really easy for me to see my step parent as being this like just evil person. I mean, I literally used to in my head to tell myself a story about how she was like this wicked witch. And it was more so I couldn't accept that the parent that I loved that was supposed to protect me wasn't like involved in it as much as he was. I always had this instinct to protect them. And I don't know if those memories, if I did have access to those, to the memories, the full memory of how involved he was, if I would still like be here today, honestly, because it's just inconceivable to think that someone that you love is capable of doing something so insanely cruel, no matter what the circumstances were or the excuses or, the involvement of drugs. It's just, I mean, I would be screaming, begging for him to help me, and he would hold me down as she did this. So, yeah, I just can't really make excuses for it anymore in the way that I did, especially when I look at it as a whole picture from like the other abuse that I was experiencing and just thinking about how all of it was sexual in nature, like the fact that I was punished by having to sleep on the floor without a blanket or pillow at times, sometimes without clothes. Like it was just all, there's just no excuse, there's no satisfactory explanation or really closure for me to gain from trying to understand how someone could allow a person to come into their house and do that to their child and stay with them and let it happen and partake in the abuse. I can't tell you for certain why they eventually broke up. I can tell you if they didn't break up, I would not be here right now. There's absolutely no way I would have made it into my teenage years. I would have most certainly unalived myself, to be frank, if not worse. So it's just, I think he would say that it was because of the abuse that he finally left her, but took him long enough. And a lot of the damage is already done. And at that point, obviously you can question, like there was evidence, a lot of evidence at that point, physical evidence of the abuse I was suffering, but what was anybody going to do about it? Because going to report her meant that you were going to be reporting him because he was involved. And even if like they couldn't prove that he was involved, he was in that house. Like nobody would believe that he didn't know what was going on. So even when it came out, the abuse that I was suffering, what was happening, it was still like, I mean, first off, there was this whole story that my dad had no idea the whole time, which just it's not true. I think I allowed him to believe it for a long time just because that's what I think that's what we both needed to believe to survive at the time. But as I got older and I understood things more clearly, I started to sort of unpack the fact that, no, you were there though. Why didn't you do anything? And sort of questioning my own desire to protect him over protecting myself and getting the help that I need by actually addressing the reality of what I experienced and not just this fabrication of what it was, and that I was only abused by one adult in that house, when that's just not the truth. Houses, I guess. Going back to speaking on healing not being linear, which I think is a pretty good theme for this little series that I'm doing, which I'm still not sure at this point if I'm going to upload this video or not. I just don't think I'm going to be able to get to a space where I'm going to feel okay with what I'm like, how I'm closing the series out. It's just like this last part, I guess, was just a lot harder for me to talk about again than I realized, even though I talked about it before in the previous videos. It's just, I have more memories of the abuse than I did then. Things that I'm not going to go into, but I mean, I even like had myself, I almost fooled myself, I think, into believing that my dad didn't really know what was going on. Like, I almost like rewriting history. It wasn't really until my grandma's funeral when another family member um, had spoken about when they were a kid, we were both kids, about, had told me about how when they were staying over at our house during this period, my dad had beat them so bad that they like peed their pants. And just hearing that, it just sort of reaffirmed in my mind what I already knew, what I had been in such denial of. Because even though I didn't have full access to the memories of it, I still had this sort of knowledge. That was around the time that I was getting contact, that was becoming aware that I might be a DID system. I wasn't diagnosed yet, but I was experiencing switches around the time that my grandma got sick, and they were becoming more apparent um, because they were becoming more. They wanted to be known that they existed at that point, I think because they were afraid for my putting myself back into a dangerous situation by becoming attached and reconnecting with family members again. And they didn't want that, so they were making themselves more known at the time. Um, but I was being told things about what happened when I was a kid without actually having certain access to the memories of it, to the full memory of it. Because having regaining access to certain memories, it's very much like receiving a flashback for somebody with PTSD. It's like reliving the moment over again. And I don't think I'll ever be at a point, to be honest, where I will be capable of recalling all the memories that have been taken away from me or hidden away. Um, I can be informed of what happened without having to remember the memory, with still having the amnesic barriers in place, because it's too horrific for me to have to just relive all of that trauma, the years of trauma that I experienced. Um, because right now, I have these like key memories that really only add up to be like a handful. But in reality, I was going through this for 6 years. So having to try to recall those things, it would not be safe for me. Which is why there's a TID system in place and why that exists. And why full integration isn't always the goal for every system. And it shouldn't be. That used to be a belief that was how you heal from DID, like forcing all of these memories to come back. But what would happen when they used to do that is people would become extremely suicidal, and then like a lot of them would become dysfunctional or even end up taking their own life. So there's a reason these amnesic barriers are in place, and it's not really up to anybody, especially someone who hasn't experienced or have any clue what it's like to experience what you experienced, trying to say that, oh, wouldn't it be better if you just didn't have all these amnesic barriers in place? Yeah, no. If they weren't there, I wouldn't be here. So there's that. I feel like society has this idea that when abuse survivors take back power over their lives and try to go get help, through therapy or whatever the means are that they need to address the trauma that they experienced, that like a switch just flips and that's just like roses and happy and like you're just going to be great after that. They don't want to see the ugly side of your trauma. There are factors in play when you're a trauma survivor that can make it really difficult for you to love other people and to let other people love you, because you spent so much of your life in a fight or flight state. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, for me, was another one, that it's really hard to snap out of that mentality and not live your entire life in survival mode. It doesn't just happen overnight. And even when you are getting better, you can get triggered back into those states, and that can last a while, and it can cause you to push people away and be, extremely reactive. I think for me, one of the largest struggles that I have is just how much the sexual abuse affected me, even like when when it was something that I had kept so far out of my mind. And then I had, gotten in a serious relationship with my now husband, and I started questioning, because I was having, regular sex that time. I started questioning, like, there were certain things that were conversations that should have been had that weren't had because I didn't know how to talk about it and I didn't even really understand it myself. But I think a part of the reason that I identify on the asexual spectrum and identify as demisexual is because I had experienced pain during sex literally every time I had sex for the longest time, for years, and I wouldn't talk about it. I knew how to put on a show. So, and this is so sad, like looking back, because it was not, it's sad for my partner, right? Because there was a lot of like guilt that came with discovering this, because I was very good at acting like I wasn't experiencing pain, and I was good at making sure that my partner was getting the pleasure that I wanted them to get out of sex. But I wasn't communicating that, hey, I'm experiencing pain. It wasn't until that I ended up having to, because I was started bleeding after sex every time. And, we were concerned that it was cancer or something. Turned out, no, my muscles were just contracting extremely intensely. Um, and I was basically forcing it, and it was causing tears inside of me. And my husband didn't know any better, because he didn't have any, he had never been with anybody else besides me at that point. So it's not like he experienced sex before. Um, so he wouldn't have known either way. But again, I was very experienced, and I was good at faking it at that point. I also enjoyed the power and control it gave me, and I enjoyed making my partners feel good. So for me, it was like a sacrifice that I was making, I guess. Like, and maybe I was used to it. I don't know, because like the only thing I knew about being touched there was pain. It was being in pain. So it took me a long time to figure out how to actually experience pleasure. And it's still something I struggle with. Like, I'm not good with allowing myself to be on the receiving end. Um, because it feels so vulnerable to me, and it's just, I have a hard time allowing myself to be touched, really. Um, and that's sad. And I remember when I first realized why I was experiencing this, that it was because of sexual abuse I experienced. I was just so angry, because it was like, why, how dare you still have this hold over me? You already infected my brain when it came to like understanding my sexuality and like questioning if I was only attracted to women because of what this person did. And now it's like I can't even enjoy penetration because of what they did, or having, making love with my spouse. So the lingering after effects of abuse are just, they're lifelong, you know? Um, and that's why it takes so long to heal from this. I feel like society just has this really warped view of how survivors are supposed to behave, or how they're supposed to take accountability and heal from their trauma. And it's just like, if only it was a flip of the switch, if only it were that simple, if only it didn't take years of therapy, if only even after doing all the work and healing, there still weren't after effects from your body just having reactions that you don't have any control over, because the body remembers the score. Um, Quoting a book that I actually haven't read, but I've heard a lot of good things about. All of that depressing shit aside, I've come a really long way. So I think I have that to be proud of. And I'm writing a book, potentially a series, that's going to, I think, play a pretty big part in my healing process and my creating closure for myself. And even though like I still have really hard days and things can feel really hard at times, I just kind of remember that, well, things got harder because I was getting better. Because the more I healed, the more I could recall and understand about the abuse that I survived. So each step towards healing was also another step towards uncovering another piece of my abuse that I hadn't fully processed, which is why healing is not linear. And sometimes it can feel like 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. I don't think I really have a poem that I want to end on today, to be honest. Well, actually, I just turned to a page that I might. This is actually written for my grandmother after she passed, so maybe we'll do that one. It's called Inhale. I lost her back in April, yet here I am, still dreaming of watermelon and morphine, sitting by your bedside, counting the seconds between each shattered breath. 1, 2, 3. Holding mine for the next rise of her chest. 4, 5, 6. It's not her grave that haunts me. 7, 8, 9. It's dying over and over again every time I wake up and remember. 10. It's November. Yet here I am still waiting to exhale again. That was Inhale, and that was written for my grandmother who passed away on hospice and who, thankfully, although she never got legal custody of me, she did take care of me. Although it wasn't right after my dad and my step-parent had broken up and were no longer together, but I moved in with her, I think, when I was about 11 years old, 10 or 11, so probably 11. Yeah, it would have been 11. She pretty much rescued me from a lot of shit, even though it wasn't perfect. It was a hell of a lot better than where I could have ended up. All right, well, stay safe, take care, and I will catch you in the next one.